Okay, yeah. And then will we need to, when the other person comes, like invite them into the, it looks like
I'm
two
gonna
participants.
Oh, wow.
Someone entered the waiting room, Stephen Brooks. Limited.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. And also over here to look for any more
Okay.
notifications that come through.
Let's see.
Okay,
Okay.
how do we make this?
Okay.
And then record this because that's what we're doing. Okay, it is.
It is recording. Okay. Are you expecting anyone else to pop in? Someone could.
Someone could, but I'll look out for that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, welcome. It really is so nice to be here. I'm have been really looking forward to getting to know you guys, chatting with you guys. I think Lucia sent out a little bit of information about me, but I'll just kind of give you a brief background. I am a school psychologist by training. I got my master's and PhD through the University of Georgia's school psychology program. And I've been working as a school psychologist in public schools for about going on 10 years now. So I did a year out in Omaha, Nebraska, where I worked in a huge metropolitan school district, and then came back to the Athens area and have been working in rural school districts ever since. For the last 4 years, I have been doing contract work. I quit working full-time when my youngest was born, and have just been doing contract school psychology work out in Franklin County. So that has been giving me some nice flexibility. But I am married. So my husband actually we met in grad school. So he's a school psychologist also, although he does not practice as one currently. And then I have 2 kids. I have a 7-year-old boy and a 4-year-old boy. They are wild and crazy. And I'm really, really glad to be in a room with adults for 2 hours today. The summer can be really, really long. So y'all,
Right, it's been different.
yeah, I was gonna say y'all don't really get a break. So okay, so I am gonna actually, before we start, if y'all will maybe just introduce yourselves and tell me, I guess, what your role is in the school and maybe what you'll be teaching, how old your kids are, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and we're all co-directors, all 4 of us. And then we are the director.
Okay.
I have an 11-year-old and a 7.5-year-old, and I'm going to teach 5 classes. And all of our classes are like this year all kind of elective type classes. A sewing class and a sewing class and a writing class.
I'm also director, as you said, and then I'm taking care of like teacher communication and some of the events. One of my classes is going to be like event planning, so the older kids will be in charge of doing some of the events. My kids are, my daughter's almost 12, and so I'm doing Be the Change, Firefly Explorers, Student Committee, and outdoor games.
Cool.
My other role is the parent volunteer coordinator.
Okay.
Get all those parents to come help us out. I have one daughter, 13 years old, and I'll be teaching over cooking and baking type classes.
Okay.
And I am kind of the website person. As my other role. I have an 11-year-old, a 7.5-year-old, and 4-year-old.
Okay.
And I'm teaching. For the other guys, I couldn't remember. I'm teaching a STEM class. Minecrafting through history.
A 7-year-old would be all over that.
Yeah, controlled chaos. What else? Team sports. And
Okay.
coding.
Cool. Yeah. Should we let those people introduce themselves?
Sure.
Okay, we can't. I don't know how that.
Oh, okay. You can.
This will be good practice though. Oh, hi. Will you
Did you just arrive? I can see you now, but we couldn't see you before.
Yeah, I can start. My name's L'Oreal, and I am not teaching anything. I saw the workshop, and I have 2 children with neurodiverse type of symptoms. So I just wanted to join in, and you guys were nice enough to let me watch. So I'm just hanging out here. Yeah.
Bring it here.
I think there's one other person who just joined.
Sorry, we're
This
figuring this
recording is
out.
So awkward.
And then, Okay, I'm gonna mute you for now, L'Oreal.
Okay. Yeah.
And then when questions come up, you can unmute yourself. And then, oh, there she is. Okay.
Hi.
Hi, Nicole. Do you want to introduce yourself? You might be muted. Hi.
Okay, I think did I unmute?
Yep.
Okay. Hey, I'm
Hi.
Nicole and I'm teaching a couple classes this fall at Firefly, and I have a 10-year-old who I've homeschooled from the beginning. So yeah, thanks for letting me join in.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
I wish I could be there in person.
Okay. There. So how do we go back to us being? Erin, do you know how to go back to it being our camera?
Did you swipe to the left? Swipe from the side. Not the top.
Like,
Is that working?
might need to give it a whirl.
Not super great.
Ooh, it should be. Like you should be able to swipe. That's weird. I mean, that would be.
We're just gonna pin it.
Okay. So here's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to start by giving a quick background in some behavioral terms. This might be something that if you've ever read in like an educational psychology class, you may or may not be familiar with some of these things. And then I'm going to give you just briefly touch on a broad framework that can be really helpful for working with challenging behavior. And then we're going to get into just a couple of broad accommodations, broad strategies that will apply to everyone. That's helpful for all students. And then we'll get into more specific accommodations that will work for different categories of neurodiversity. So sometimes I have a habit of just going. So please jump in. I want you to jump in with your questions or for clarification. I have kind of planned in a couple of different stop points for questions, but don't wait for those if you have a burning question. Okay, so when Lucia contacted me, she contacted me about doing a training for how to work with neurodiverse students. And just for background for people who maybe aren't as familiar with that term, I was trained in a very more traditional psychopathology way of looking at this. So this is kids with autism, with ADHD. These are kids with deficits, with disability. And from a neurodiversity perspective, we're looking at these characteristics more as just differences. And I think it is a nice framework. It really shifts, it doesn't necessarily change anything about the kid, but it can shift our perspective in valuing these differences, looking for strengths, rather than viewing them as something that's wrong with them that we have to fix. So I do really like that terminology. If you'll turn the page, I want to give you a background of the traditional behaviors view of behavior, because I know a lot of you maybe in this room and some of you joining us come from a more positive parenting approach. I think we said, so more like gentle parenting, respectful communication, those kinds of things. Maybe not kind of trying to avoid as much as you can punishments and rewards as a way of controlling behavior. From a behaviorist perspective, there is some of that, but I think the whole framework can be really useful, especially when you have a challenging behavior that you just really can't figure out. I find myself going back to this. So a behaviorist would chart these 4 things when they're looking at a behavior. They would chart the setting events first. Those would be any conditions that make a behavior more likely to occur. So on the next page, I give an example, a personal example. And I'll just share that here. So the setting events might be, I have company coming over, my house is a wreck, and my kids are being insane. The noise level is really high, overstimulated, I'm stressed, I'm anxious. Those are the setting events. I'm sure we have all had those setting events before. The antecedent would be the event that immediately precedes the behavior. So that would be the trigger, or sometimes it's referred to as the stimulus, kind of what sets you off or sets the student off. So in this case, my kids might come to me, both of them at once. They are clamoring for my attention, both talking to me, asking me for things, and the behavior happens. I snap, I yell at them, I banish them to their rooms so that I can go not with me. Then we have the consequence. The consequence is what immediately follows the behavior. And it can make the behavior more likely to occur in the future or less likely to occur in the future. So in my example, let's say my kids, they tuck their little tail between their legs, they go to their rooms, they are quiet, they don't bother me again, I finish all of my cleaning before my company. In that situation, a behaviorist would say, well, they have rewarded you for your outburst. You are more likely to treat that behavior. I might be more likely in the future to yell at them and send them to their rooms because it worked. Or in my family, and probably in a lot of families, what usually happens is my kids yell at me, argue, scream, cry, maybe go to their rooms, but not really. They're out of their rooms. And then we get this power struggle. Everybody's more stressed out. The house is still a mess. That would be considered a punishment. I realized, oh, wow, this made things worse. I was not successful. This behavior did not achieve the desired result. And maybe in the future, I'll remember and say, okay, I know not to get into that power struggle. Instead, I'm going to find them a quiet activity while I get my cleaning done. So a lot of times when we think of like behaviorism, we think of trying to control a behavior or modify behavior by implementing rewards, strategically using rewards and punishments to try to change a kid's behavior. What research tells us a lot of times, and what if you have a challenging kid, you maybe have experienced this or maybe have gone through challenging phases with your kids. For a lot of those kids, punishments and rewards, they just don't work. Maybe you might see a small change for a moment. If you're lucky, you might get a small change for a moment, but you're not getting that long-term lasting effect. So what the other way that you can really think about how you can help change a behavior is by looking at those setting events and those antecedents. What can you do preventatively? What factors can you change to make it so that the behavior doesn't occur in the first place? So that's what we're going to primarily focus on today. I'm going to give you guys a lot of different strategies to keep in mind to try to head off issues and set kids up for success. But I want you to keep this flow chart essentially in mind, because it can be really helpful. Like I said, if you run into a problem and you've kind of put everything in place to do, but it continues to be a problem. Maybe you've done some problem solving with the kid, but you're just stumped. sometimes it can be really helpful to sit, if this is a behavior that is happening regularly, and write down, okay, the setting event, I notice through my notes that it tends to happen on Monday mornings. Maybe it tends to happen during unstructured times on Monday mornings. Then maybe the antecedent, I've asked the kids to get in groups, and all of a sudden there's an outburst. Maybe the consequences, then I say, I isolate the kid. I'm not saying that's what you would do, but maybe I isolate the kid to be by themselves. Well, maybe over some time you can start seeing a pattern, and then you can form some hypotheses essentially and try to intervene from there. One reason why it is important, even if you aren't intentionally using rewards and punishments to control behavior, it is important to keep that in mind, because sometimes we are putting some rewards and punishments into place, or maybe other kids are, or circumstances are, that might be affecting behavior that we need to think about. You know, how maybe you are contributing to a behavior in some way that you're not realizing. So I think it'd be helpful to think about, you know, is the student always getting a laugh from their classmates when they do X, Y, and Z? Or something that we see a lot in schools is, you know, a kid hates math. They flip a chair every time it's math time, and they have to be sent out of the room. Well, now they've escaped their math work, and that becomes a pattern because it's more important to them to escape that math because it's so horrible for whatever reason, then, you know, it is, the punishment is bad to them. Does that make sense? Like the reward outweighs the cost. And so we might see that again. So you can get kind of caught in those tricky situations sometimes. So it is important just to keep that in mind. But the other thing is you might start seeing those patterns in the setting events, the antecedents, what might be setting the kid off. Maybe on Monday they're having more separation anxiety, and as the week goes on, they're feeling more comfortable. Maybe they don't really have the skills or the tools to work in groups, and they are super, super anxious. And that's what's setting them off. Maybe it's the unstructured time itself, they just need more structure. So this can really help you dissect a problem as it's occurring. Okay, if you will switch to page 7, are any of you guys familiar with Ross Green? Okay. Ross Green is someone that has been doing work in working with kids with challenging behavior for a long time. He has several books, and I've listed them at the back in the resources. He has a really, really great approach, I think, for working with challenging behavior. His approach is called collaborative problem solving. And his, I guess his kind of major idea is kids do well if they can. We have kids that, you know, might be a chronic behavior problem in the classroom. They don't want to be a behavior problem. Maybe it looks like they're intentionally trying to get your goat or whatever. But at the end of the day, kids don't want to be in that position, even if it seems like it. They want to do well if they can. When kids aren't doing well, it's because there's some sort of unsolved problem underlying the behavior. And a lot of times there's a missing skill. So there is a skill that's required to be successful in this situation, and they just simply don't have that skill. Welcome. That's okay, come on in. So some of the things that might be missing, they might be missing like executive functioning skills or emotion regulation skills, de-escalation strategies. This is for you. So, and that's kind of your goal, is to, the collaborative side of this is you are working with the child or with the parent or with everyone to really analyze what's going on, to really drill down and figure out what the underlying problems are and to solve them. So from his perspective, the challenging behavior itself isn't the problem, it's the signal of the problem. It lets us know that there is a bigger problem underneath that we need to solve. And so that's where the work comes in. He has, if you go to, trying to remember the name of his website, I have it linked in the back. Lives in the Balance. There it lists on page 33, lists all of his books. Actually, that's not true. He has more books, but these are, I think, are the biggest ones, 3 biggest ones. And then Lives in the Balance has a ton of resources. So his system is very systematic, and he gives you a very detailed way that you can, you know, use a rating scale to help find unsolved problems, use forms to help identify the problem. So if you want to get into it more seriously, or if maybe you have a problem with your kid that keeps coming up that you just can't figure out, it can really be helpful to at least familiarize yourself with these steps, because I think it can be helpful even if you aren't following the strategy step by step. It can be helpful just as a background and a framework for respectfully working through a problem with your child or your student. The other thing is, have any of you guys heard, actually, before I say that, one other thing I wanted to point out. You are going to have students, and maybe even when you think about your own kids, I know this is true for both of my children. When I think about, okay, what are all the problems? What are all the missing skills that they have that they need to work on that will help them be more successful? Like when I even start to go there in my mind, the list is like forever long. And that might be true with some students too. When that happens, we're not trying to tackle everything at once. We're just not going to be successful at anything if we try to do that. So what he advises is that you pick the top problems, a couple of them, and you pick the problems that are going to have the broadest impact. So the biggest impact on the student, maybe it's also having the most positive impact on the classroom, the teacher. So look for those things. What are going to be most immediately beneficial, have the biggest impact? Address those first. All the other behaviors we're going to let go for now. We're going to come back to those when the student has a handle on some of these other things. And that's nice. It kind of gives you permission to let some of those things go and not fix everything all at once. Okay, does anybody know Dr. Becky? Do you love Dr. Becky? Okay, you all need to know Dr. Becky. She's great. She started on Instagram. I think she's a child psychologist. She's really, really amazing. She really comes from a positive parenting perspective, very respectful communication. Really, her strategies really focus on building the child up from within.
I've been telling you guys the one with all the scripts.
Yes, yes, and I think that is why. I mean, she's not just so good in her content, but in her work, she gives you amazing scripts to use, and I think that's so helpful. Because I know I always find myself fumbling for words, you know, when it comes to my kids, and even having the scripts, I sometimes do, but it's helpful. Anyway, follow her on Instagram if you have Instagram. But also, she just came out with a podcast that is so good. It's really, really good. So if you're a podcast person, subscribe to her podcast because it's really good. And a lot of her, I mean, she's definitely talking to parents, but a lot of her strategies, you know, your parenting strategies apply to teaching, of course. And she does a lot of talk about, you know, problems that maybe younger kids face, but she also touches on, I mean, a lot of the topics apply very broadly. But also she does have some topics about older kids as well. But anyway, she said something the other day that really stuck with me as a mantra that has just been so helpful to me. She said, when you have a problem, don't think about it as me against my kid or me against my student. Think about it as me and my student against the problem. We're on the same team. We're trying to figure out what's going on here and how we can fix it together. So I think that's a really helpful, for me at least, a helpful perspective, and it really fits in with Ross Green's work. Okay, questions? So before we get into more specific areas of neurodiversity, you will catch me say disability because that is what I'm so used to. That is what we say in school and in a clinical setting. But I really do try to catch myself when I can. But before I get into that, I'm going to give just some broad strategies that you guys can use. And I'm going to start with some things that you can do proactively before the school year even starts. When do you guys start in August? Okay. And maybe these are some things that you already have in place. And you maybe won't want to do all of these, but maybe some things will jump out to you as things that you might find useful. So the first thing is to send out, you want to gather information about your students. You could send out a questionnaire. I put an example one in your packet that I think is actually really good, but it is more geared towards more traditional school, like more traditional classes. So as you guys expand into more like academic classes, some of these questions may be more applicable then, but you might, if you do decide to send out any kind of questionnaire, you might pull from some of these questions or modify some of these questions and then add your own. But I like getting the parents' perspective about what they see as challenges that their kids have, what challenges they anticipate their kids might have, what strategies work for their kids. You know your kids best. You can give great advice about what works and what won't work for your kids. So it's nice to have that information before a problem even arises. And then also getting some of that information from the students themselves. What are they interested in? What do they want teachers to know about them? What's been hard for them in the past? What are they worried about? Those kinds of things. So I think those can kind of start giving you some clues about what other strategies you might need to plan to put in place from the very beginning. Invite parents to meet before the school year starts. I think an in-person meeting or a Zoom meeting can be really helpful, especially if the parent knows that their kid is going to have, more difficulty. Just kind of providing that setting where you guys can talk about and really kind of do some problem solving, I guess, ahead of time for plans that might need to be put in place. Okay, something that can be really helpful for, honestly, I think this is helpful for all kids, but then there are some kids that it will be even more helpful for, is creating a social story or some sort of document that can describe what to expect before school starts. So for younger kids, this might include pictures. Hi, I'm your teacher. Here's what I look like. My name is Miss whatever they're going to call you. Here's what our classroom looks like. This is what we're going to be doing during our classroom, and maybe giving a general outline of the day. With younger kids, it's going to be including a lot of pictures. Real pictures are better than, like clip art from the internet, but that works too. And then for older kids, it'll be less pictures, more text of what they can expect. That way they're coming into the situation. There's less unknowns. There's less to be anxious about, less to be worried about. I've used social stories a lot with my own kids and have found them to be really, really helpful. I use them for problem solving when my kids fight all the time. And so we've used that for kind of teaching de-escalation strategies or, strategies that they can use to solve a problem on their own. And that can be really helpful. It's definitely, obviously it's a lot of legwork to begin with, but then it's a tool you can come back to over and over.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
About like what would go in the social story.
Mhm.
Should I lean forward and shout? Would that help?
Oh, I can repeat the question
Okay.
for people
As
watching.
far as that goes, like most of our classes are pretty small, like 12 to 14, something like that. Nicole and I are actually in a class that is like 22. Is that right?
Okay.
And in my mind, it kind of takes me back to like my public school days, like don't smile till December kind of a thing.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, if we don't walk into that classroom with goals and rules and like we're gonna have
Mhm.
chaos because these are 22 homeschool children who are not used to being in a classroom of that size.
And maybe haven't been together with other kids either for a
Exactly,
long
yeah.
time.
So I'm wondering in that social story, we want to keep it sort of light and inviting and like, we're so excited to have you, or is it okay to be like, this is a giant classroom and we're gonna have these boundaries in place to keep us all safe? And like,
Yeah, I think you could like get started on it and kind of see how it goes. I would definitely, if it's something that you're giving right at the outset, I think it is important just kind of as a, here's what to expect, you know, light and inviting, here's what the space looks like, here's kind of the general flow of our day. But if there are critical rules that kids need to know about, or what do I do when I need to go to the bathroom? You know, if you have little kids, those are things that you can include. For young kids, you don't want it to be too long.
right.
So I think you just kind of just put it all out there and then see where you need to scale back, I think. And then you might find as time goes on that maybe if there's a certain kid that can also be a useful tool. If you have a kid that's really having trouble adjusting and there are several problems, you can then go back and make a specific story for that kid of, you know, describing maybe the procedure around this one time that you're really having trouble with. Okay, I'm gonna wait till Lucia gets back because I think the next thing is important about creating an emergency plan. I'm gonna skip that for now. The next thing is think about environmental problems that you might have when you're thinking about kind of like universal design, how we can include everyone. Think about what are some things in the classroom that could be barriers, just environmentally. Some students in a classroom of 22 are going to be completely overwhelmed by the chaos and the noise. So maybe noise canceling headphones, or maybe you play some quiet music to help, you know, kind of make it a little more peaceful. Or if you have those overhead fluorescent lights, I know that can just add to the sensory.
I don't think.
Oh, okay, good.
We have great lighting,
Okay.
lots of windows.
Or if it's like a really echoey space. Those are just some things that maybe it's not anything that strikes you right at first, but it is something you can keep in mind as the school year goes on. And then I know you guys talked about, or I think Lucia, you mentioned that you guys were gonna have like a calm down, cool down, chill out space.
We're
Maybe
looking at having a mask break area.
a mask break area.
Yeah.
Well, I think initially, I probably put it in the info too, we were talking about if the child is having a really hard time in the classroom and feeling overwhelmed in general, that we would have a spot for them to go. We just, you know, walk through the building, we're trying to figure out where to put it.
There's not really like a lobby, it's sort of a hall with
Mhm.
classrooms up, so.
I did see they have blow up chairs at Five Below that are tiny.
Something that you can do, which is really nice, is to create a space within each room. I don't know how much flexibility you have to, is this,
Just one day a week that we're there.
and you have to like, you can't like set up a classroom. Okay, so what you could do though, is you could have like a kit, like a cool down kit that you carry in a box. Every teacher has one. We set it up over here. It includes headphones. It includes, I don't know, maybe one of those like, those like, yeah, those poppy things, or those like timers that like are fun to watch.
Like our little babysitters called Kid Kids.
If you have younger kids, it could be, maybe you do have a social story that is about calming down. You can put your social story in there. If you do choose to do something like that, you'll want to read it with the kid first, so that they then are just going back through and pre-teaching some strategies for calming down. But it is, I do think it's nice to have that kids know it is available to them. They can go there on their own if they need to, when they start to feel themselves getting worked up.
And to separate it from ever being like a timeout, is this something a kid should always choose on their own, or do you ever suggest?
I think you can suggest it for sure. Sometimes kids don't see that they're getting to that point. And you could say, I've noticed in your body that you look like you're starting to get pretty anxious. Why don't you go to get, and they may choose to do it or they may not. I think it's just how you frame it, whether it feels like a punishment or not.
Or if it's embarrassing, it's going to class, or if it's a reward because there's hard candy in there, you know? Like,
Right. And it can be something that they don't have to go to a certain area. I mean, it could be something that you say, why don't you take like 5 minutes in your area, like put on your, for an older kid, like put in your headphones, listen to the music you want to until you're feeling better, and like you can rejoin the class. So, especially with older kids, we want to give them as avenues to save face. We don't want to embarrass them, of course. So thinking about kind of what is an appropriate way that you feel is okay for you in your classroom to let someone calm down, and just kind of think about what some of those things can be. I want to get back to creating an emergency plan. So you've put everything in place. You've done everything at the forefront. Maybe you've worked with a specific kid, put in some strategies, but there's a huge outburst. It happened. Okay. What are you going to do about it? I think it's important to have an emergency plan in place. So I'll make some suggestions and then just think about what your resources are so you can think about how you can handle that. If it's never happened with a kid before, I guess kind of the general emergency plan maybe that you would have for all kids is, first I would try to have a teacher on site that is not actually teaching a class, or a volunteer, someone that can come and take that child out of the classroom, invite that child out of the classroom. And maybe you do have a space that you set up that is for more significant needs, or if a kid might actually just say, I need to get out of this room for a minute. And maybe you could use your space in that way. But in an emergency, I really think removing the child from that situation. Now, of course, we run into that escape. Maybe that's what they wanted. But if it's becoming a danger, and you've tried, of course, you will have tried to de-escalate the situation. It might happen, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that you've done something wrong, or maybe it means that you did. You hit a trigger and, oh, I'm so sorry. I knew that was hard for you, but here you are. So I would have that adult that can come help you. Sometimes a kid won't leave the room and they dig in their heels and that becomes a power struggle. I wouldn't even engage. I would then have that adult just quietly and as nonchalantly, we're not making this a big deal. Guys, we're gonna go outside for a few minutes. I've got a great book to read to you. And you guys leave the room to go to some other designated space that you know that you can use. Just escort the class quietly out. If you need to address it with the class, just, we're not trying to embarrass them or talk about details, but you can see they were having a hard time. They just needed a minute to calm down. We're going to give them the space to do that. We've all had a hard time before and that kind of thing. I know that's always a concern. Like, how do we address the student's behavior without causing that embarrassment? And then I would make sure you have all the parents' numbers. And if the kid can't get it back together, you can call the parents and have them help. And if it is a recurrent problem, you might need to set up a situation where the parent is asked to remain on campus, maybe in the building or just in their car, so that they can be called in to help with the student. I think if you put everything in place, and when you guys have a problem with the student, put your heads together. You will come up with a better plan collaboratively together than you will on your own. And it's also nice because I know working with students in public schools, also being a parent, it feels like you have to know the answer. Like, you have to solve the problem. And if you can't fix it, you have failed in some way. And I think, like, alleviate yourself from that burden right now. Look at it as a team effort. We're going to do the most that we can to support this kid. Questions about any of that?
We also mentioned asking a parent to attend the class with a student if it's a situation we can't, we think that would make it worse, or just ask them to meet on campus.
I think that's going to be really student to student, and it will depend on the parent too. So I think once you feel out that dynamic, I mean, give it a try. If it seems like it won't embarrass the student and that they will still be in the classroom able to benefit from the activities with their parent there, you could give it a try. And then if it's not working, you evaluate. But you'll get to know, I think.
It depends on the age of the kids.
And maybe not thinking of it as an ultimatum, but just more of like as a strategy that we're going to try.
I keep wondering too about like thinking through what the trigger is, like you're saying, it's like so important, because if I'm the trigger, then that other teacher is going to be a huge help. Like if I'm the one that
And
messed
that
up,
totally happens. Yeah.
then, but like if the parent is another trigger, it might make the classroom so much more fun.
Yeah. And I think you'll be able to feel that out as you get to know.
It's a good option to have on the table just in case.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And the other option, you can just sit in the hallway and read a book for the whole time.
I mean, that is the balance.
Not the child, but the parent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just realize when the child in the hallway.
I mean, I think that is something you have to think about is, you know, it's not just you and your kid at home doing your homeschooling. It is you and 25 kids that all have to feel safe, all have to feel like, you know, and so that is a tough balance because you don't want to just kick someone out, of course, but that gives some options. Okay, the first day of class. So you said, Erin, you said you taught before. Okay, what did you teach? Spanish. High school Spanish. Awesome. Okay. So you then know like what the rundown is for the first few days of class. And for you guys, it's just one day a week, so it's going to be the first several weeks. You're going to teach and reteach expectations, procedures, routines, rules, model, show what it looks like, have the kids walk through it and practice, especially those younger kids are going to really, really need that. And you're going to really want to think about as much of your day that can be, or as much of your class that can have procedures in them, the easier it will be for kids. They'll know exactly what to do. So think about where some of those tricky moments you might anticipate. Is it, we're doing a project and I have to help one student over here. Well, what is everybody else going to be doing? Or we're now transitioning from this activity to another. Well, transitions are often a tricky time for any kid, and it can cause a lot of dead time and a lot of time where kids might kind of go astray a bit. So how am I going to do those transitions? How am I going to teach my kids those transitions? So think about, what am I going to do with materials? How are kids expected to handle materials and help put things away and get things out and those kinds of things? It is a lot to think about, especially if you've never done it before, and you're going to mess it all up, and that's okay. And you're going to learn and you're going to put things in place, and every day it's going to get better. Every semester it's going to get better and easier. But just keep that in mind. The other thing that we all know is so important is building connections with kids, and especially those kids that you anticipate as needing the connection more than others. Are kids that do tend to have more behavior problems or more challenging behavior, need that personal connection the most with the teacher. Peter, what? I think I get into a strategy at some point in here to give you an idea of one way you can go about doing that. Okay, of course, you want to develop safe, positive, collaborative classroom climate, not one where, you know, you do as I say, but one where we're a team. And one thing that you might want to do is there might be some rules that just have to be rules for safety reasons. Only the teacher touches the chemicals, whatever your class is, but it's nice if you ask your students to help you come up with a list of rules. Usually they hit everything that you think is important, and maybe even some other things. You could also frame it, or in addition, talk about what are our classroom values, what's important to us as a class. And I think especially thinking about our older kids, giving them some leadership here. What are the values that we want to have as a class? Hopefully aiming for community, support, respect, those kinds of things. But usually those things are going to come up. Those will be the things that they actually value. But I think it's nice to have students help you generate those ideas, because then they have more ownership of it. Okay. So here are some strategies, just general strategies for increasing engagement. The more kids are engaged in what you're doing, the more they're attending to what you're doing, interested, excited, the less opportunity there will be for them to have behavior challenges in their classroom, the more invested they are. So here are some things. Some of these things might feel like they apply more to more traditional academic classes. But one thing is teaching using multiple modalities. So this is especially true. It seems like a lot of the things that y'all are going to be doing, are going to be very fun and just naturally very interesting. But just to think about if you do end up doing more traditional classroom teaching of academic subjects, the more you can incorporate diverse ways of teaching. So I don't mean like teaching to a specific learning style for a specific kid. What I do mean is I'm including video, I'm including visuals, I'm including activities. The more different angles and different ways that we can teach a concept, the more connections we're making, the better kids are going to understand it more deeply and be able to remember and retain that information later on. Also, the more interesting it is. And you're only going to remember and learn if you are actually paying attention. Differentiate instruction. This is something that is super important for your academic subjects, but also really does apply to kind of extracurricular things as well. Differentiating instruction really just means thinking about what the experience level is, the ability level is of all of my students. And we all have the same learning goal, making slime, but maybe I need to recognize that every kid in my class needs a different level of help or a different level of instruction to get there. When it comes to academics, maybe you are teaching a history class, but everyone in there has a different reading level. So you still want to teach the same content, but you might have to find other resources to allow that student to access the material. So a lower reading level, or maybe it's an audio presentation, or maybe there's a student or a group of students that you have to work with in a small group. Maybe the large group instruction just goes over their head and they need it repeated. So when you're thinking about differentiated instruction, you're trying to think about how you can make your instruction match each student's individual level where they are. It's really hard, especially hard in a big classroom with lots and lots of kids. Emphasizing active learning, which you guys, that might just built into what you're doing. Inquiry-based learning strategies. So this is more kind of letting the kids take the reins. So let's say you're doing like a STEM class, you might come in with a question as the teacher, kind of a broad guiding question, or introduce a topic maybe in a broad way. Here's what we're going to be talking about. Here's what we're going to be learning. You might then set the kids off in groups and have them come up with some questions or some hypotheses on their own. And then they're either doing research to find the answers to their own questions, or maybe they're doing experiments through whatever STEM project you have set up, drawing their own conclusions, and then we're coming back together as a class and sharing what we've learned. Integrate student interest. This is important for making, having students latch on to what you're doing. Okay, this is where, so building strong personal relationships. There's a strategy called the 2x10 method, or I've also seen it referred to as micro conversations. And this is a very explicit strategy that you can use if there is a student that you're just really, either you're having a lot of behavioral challenges from them, or you just feel like you aren't connecting with them, or they really aren't engaged in the class. A very simple thing to do is to make a concerted effort to talk to them for 2 minutes every day, preferably at the beginning of the class, but if it has to be at the end, it's still impactful. Talk to them for 2 minutes every time you meet for 10 consecutive meetings, or however much you can do. You're not talking about school. You're not talking about problems that they're having. You're talking about what is interesting to them. You're getting to know them. And letting them guide the discussion. You might need to have some prompts, but that can be a really powerful way to build that connection with somebody that you feel like that connection isn't there. And of course, we can probably all think back to our own schooling and those teachers that we loved, those teachers that we felt so connected to. Those are probably classes that you worked really hard in, and classes that you wanted to. You know, there is that social motivation here, and when you feel respected. So that is a really powerful thing, I think, to use with those students, especially that are having a harder time. Cooperative work, allowing choice. So in many ways, especially with kids that you do find kind of getting into power struggles with, as much choice as you can allow. Always make sure the choices are acceptable to you. You probably know that through your parenting, where you have provided a choice that you're really like, well, actually, we really can't leave grandma's house right now. So, okay, giving students helping jobs too can be really a good way to get kids engaged. Okay, we're about to move on to specific areas of neurodiversity and some strategies that tend to be useful for them. But before we do you guys have any questions?
I have a question about if you have kids that either are younger or they're having some kind of a challenge in a group and maybe they just don't even want to talk about it. They, you know, you try and what's going on? What's the problem? I don't know if they don't want to talk about it. I mean, how do you work with them on, you know, what's the cause of that behavior problem and what's going on? And if either they can't tell you or they just don't want to tell you.
Yeah. So I think in that situation, first, you definitely talk about the problem at a time, you know, away from the problem. So, and I think sometimes you have to offer some ideas. Like, is it, you know, if they really don't know, is it this? Could it be this? How would this solution feel? What solution do you know, also talking with parents, like touch base with the parents, because maybe this is something that has come up at their house a lot. I know my 4-year-old in social situations can be so aggressive and can be so, not necessarily physically, but just it comes off as rude. You know, an adult might ask him a question and he will scowl at them and not answer. Or a kid, he might say, I hate that kid. And it has taken me a long time to realize he's anxious. Like, he is an anxious kid in those situations. He could have never told me that. He would not have been able, because we've tried to problem solve around this. But that is something I think parents might have an insight for you that maybe the kid couldn't express themselves. So I think in those situations, if the kid isn't willing to talk about it, or if they just don't have insight into it, I think you have to take some guesses, but still working with the kid.
Yeah. So just from like a practical standpoint, like if you're saying, you know, we have a group of kids, okay, we're going to do this. And they're like, no, I'm not doing that. In that moment, do you just let them do whatever they want? Like, how do you, you know, like kind of steer that back to what?
I mean, I think it really just depends on the situation, okay, and what's going on. You know, I think using playfulness with any age, humor, playfulness, you know, is the best that you could do. If someone's not going to participate and you have done everything that you know how to do, I think that's a situation where, you know, you don't want to get into a power struggle, and definitely not in front of a whole class kind of thing. If they're not doing anything unsafe, maybe let them be and then address it afterwards. What was going on? You know, what something must have felt hard to you about that moment. And that's where you might get into that problem solving with them to then hopefully address it in the future. Does that answer the question at all?
A little bit.
Okay. It's tricky.
Yeah.
It's tricky. Other questions? Okay. All right. So the first category that we're going to talk about is autism spectrum disorders. And we all might be at different areas kind of knowing what constitutes an autism spectrum disorder. So first I want to just go through what the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, this is what clinicians, psychologists use, psychiatrists use to actually diagnose disorders. So you will see the word deficit in here, and that is because that is how it is characterized. The first category, there's two main categories with this most recent version of the DSM. The first one is that there are deficits in social communication and social interaction. And then you'll see there are 3 bullet points below. For a student to be formally diagnosed, they have to meet all 3 of those sub-criteria. The first one is that they're going to have deficits in social emotional reciprocity. So they might struggle with that back and forth conversation, with the back and forth nature of social interactions. Social interactions with the student conversations might feel very one-sided. Either it's all coming from you, or maybe it's all coming from them. They're talking at you.
These are positive interactions, not like.
And any interaction, just kind of neutral interactions. If you're trying to have a conversation, I've worked with kids who they are happy to talk to me. And they do seem to enjoy talking and the social aspect of that conversation, but it's a dump of, you know, maybe their special interests. And every time I try to connect, they aren't showing interest necessarily in my side of things or something, you know, that I've had to say. They're not listening to what I said and then responding the way we do in that back and forth. Maybe it's more one-sided. Or I've also worked with kids where I've had to do all the work in initiating and I'm not getting that response back. So it's not that like natural back and forth. That comes to us very, you know, or a neurotypical person very naturally. Okay. You might also see reduced sharing interests with others, a reduced range of affect and emotion. So emotions might just kind of see blunted. Emotions can be kind of blunted. And then they might not initiate social interactions as much. The next area looks at nonverbal communication that we use for social interaction. So when we think about our communication that we use when we're interacting with people, we use words, but we also use tone of voice, we use our eye contact, we use our hands, we use facial expressions, we use all sorts of things to express ourselves and in a social way as well. So this can be something that can be harder for students on the autism spectrum. So you might see like abnormal eye contact is the first thing, you know, that you hear about. So, and this is maybe not true for all kids diagnosed as being on the spectrum. Some kids, their eye contact might feel okay. Some kids may never look at you. Some kids may look at you, but it just feels off. And so it can, you know, it can range any of those things, but there's something that is difficult for them about that nonverbal communication. The last thing that the last criteria that they have to meet in this first area is just a general deficit or delay in understanding, developing, maintaining, understanding relationships. So they're having a hard time making friends, keeping friends. Maybe they relate well to adults, but it could be very difficult for them to relate and understand kids their own age. Okay.
So it's the nonverbal community. If we notice that in a child that maybe it's been shared with us that they have this challenge, should we assume also that they are going to find it challenging to read our sort of aspect?
Yes. So I think that is, and this, I'll show you a cool visual in a few slides, but it's going to vary kid to kid. And I think you will learn through observation and interaction, but you can also ask the parent, okay, what are the things that are hard for them? And a lot of students on the spectrum aren't going to read into that. And you need to be very explicit about expectations or in your communication. They might have a hard time with figurative language. So it's raining cats and dogs. That will feel very literal to them, like, oh my gosh, what are you talking about? And there's a lot of that we do without thinking about it until you are trying to be aware of it. So I think the more explicit that you can be, the better. Okay. The next criteria that has to be met is that there is restricted, repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And the student has to have just 2 in this list below. So one thing that might be going on is stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects, or speech. So this is what you might hear referred to as stimming. So you might hear, and stimming is self-stimulating behavior. So you might see, it might be something as simple as doing their fingers or rocking, or some kids jump, spin. It might be a really big, complex movement. It might include some vocalizations. It might be spinning something and in a repetitive way, using an object in a repetitive way, but it is for the purpose of self-stimulating. And we're going to get into that a little bit more because I know that can be a concern sometimes in the classroom. If it is disruptive, what should I do about it? The next thing is insistence on sameness. So another way to think about this is behavioral rigidity. So this is a kid that's going to need, that routine is going to be important to them. They're going to need to follow it the way that it was initially planned. And if there's deviations from that plan, it's going to be really challenging for them to move on from that. And so we'll talk about some accommodations that you can make. And a lot of kids are like that. A lot of adults are like that also. Some adults are better at going with the flow than others. All people benefit from, warnings about changes in routine. So a lot of the, I'm going to tell you some specific strategies that are helpful, often helpful for kids on the spectrum, but you'll, as you read them, you're like, oh, this is going to be good for a lot of kids. This would be good for me. Like, these things wouldn't hurt anyone. Okay, the next thing is highly restricted or fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity. So some kids might have something that they are just obsessed with, that they know everything about, they want to learn everything about it, they want to talk to you about it all the time. It is on their mind constantly. And it can change, and it will change as they get older. It might be, dinosaurs when they're 5, and maybe it moves into Civil War, or, it's going to change throughout their lifetime. But again, not everybody has this characteristic. The last one on this list is sensory oversensitivity or undersensitive. So they might get overwhelmed, overstimulated very easily. So noises, they might be very sensitive to noises or smells or visual things, or maybe they're understimulated. Maybe it takes a lot for them to notice a noise. They're not quite as reactive, if that makes sense. Or another thing that you might see is that there's, and ties into this, this sensory sensitivity, is that there might be an unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment. So a student might smell things a lot, or look at, like it's called visual inspection, but maybe they notice that the light plays off the fence in this particular way. And so maybe they're running by the fence, looking out of the corner of their eye, or getting down and watching their cars, so a lot of this is just an interest in the sensory aspects of the world.
Are stemming and sensory things related, or are they two different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that the stimming serves a different purpose. And we're going to talk about it later, but I think a lot of times it can be a self-regulatory thing. Mhm.
So it's more about like the repetition than the sensory input, maybe?
Yeah, and maybe there is some relation there. It really is something I've never considered. It's a good question. Like if they are seeking some sensory input, is it for a self-regulatory purpose? Maybe. I don't know. Okay, this next graphic I think is really helpful in thinking about a kid on the spectrum. In the dark circles, social communication deficits and repetitive behaviors, those are the two main criteria that any person who is formally diagnosed satisfies. So there would be deficits in those areas, but there's also a lot of deficits that co-occur very frequently, and it's going to be different from kid to kid. So a lot of kids on the spectrum also have a language disability. So it's not just in how they use language for social purposes, but it's also their level of how much oral language do they understand, their receptive language. How advanced or developmentally appropriate is their expressive language? How can they express themselves? So you'll find a lot of kids are delayed in that area. You probably have often heard that kids, a big sign of autism early on is that kids aren't talking. Maybe they're not babbling, they're not talking before age 2. So you see those, you see that early on. A lot of kids, not all kids, also have a co-occurring intellectual disability. So their just general cognitive abilities are delayed compared to other kids their age. You also see in that irritability circle, tantrums, aggression, self-injury can occur more often. And then we have this cluster of hyperactivity, inattention. A lot of kids with ADHD or with autism are also diagnosed with ADHD. So that executive functioning can be impaired. Then you see a lot of, you can see like mood disorders, anxiety disorders. Some kids on the spectrum have very strong fears or very unusual fears of things that just seem very odd to be scared of. So that can happen sometimes. Or just a general anxiety, maybe a social anxiety because those situations are so hard. And you also see things like sleep problems, GI problems, seizure disorders that can also occur. So there can be a lot going on. Okay. The next thing, this was actually something, so like I said, in my training, I was trained in a much like a psychopathology way to look at it. It's a more like, I guess, classical way of thinking about disorder. But more recently, I have been listening to autistic voices and what are adults with autism, what do they have to say? They have a lot to say. And we have a lot to learn from them, I think, in how our practices affect them in their lives, because they've been there, they've been through it. And I think it's really enlightening. But one thing that I ran across that I really liked was when we think about this spectrum, sometimes we think about it as a linear thing. Either you are very autistic on this end, or you're just a little autistic on this end, talking about severity or how functionally impaired maybe somebody is. But what it really looks like is this wheel of symptoms. And if you turn to the next page, and this wheel on this doesn't have every symptom on there, but just as an example, you can see maybe I have a lot of this symptom, this impacts me greatly, or this area is very hard for me, but I have less in this area. I'm just as autistic as this other person, but our wheels look completely different. Our functioning is very different. What's hard for us is very different. So I think that's important to keep in mind. I'm going to give you a list of strategies, but not every kid with autism who walks in your door is going to do those strategies. So it's really going to be getting to know the kid and what they need and where their strengths and weaknesses and challenges are. Okay, special consideration. Has anybody heard the term person first language? Okay, this was something that was drilled into my head in grad school. And then when I taught in grad school, I also taught educational psychology, and I drilled it into my students' heads as well. And this is the idea of we're putting the individual first. The individual is not the disability. And so what we're saying, an example would be a person with autism, a student with ADHD, he has a learning disability. In contrast to an autistic person, an ADHD student, he is learning disabled. Can you feel the difference there? In a lot of disability categories, that is the preference for people. But in the autistic community, it varies person to person. A lot of autistic people have really embraced this as a special part of themselves, and they don't feel that it's a disability. They feel that it's a difference. And they claim that very proudly, and they want to be called an autistic person. And so I mention this because that's something that I've been trying to be more aware of. But I think it's just something, if you do have a student and their parent has disclosed that they are on the spectrum, you can just ask, well, when we talk about it, how do you want me to refer to your student? As an autistic, you know, if I'm if needed, you know, I'm just gonna say like, I'm the autistic person in that. But when talking about it, what is your preference? What is your child's preference? And those things might actually be different. Okay, so stimming. Let's talk a little bit more about that. So like I said, it's these repetitive, unusual movements or noises, and it helps the student regulate emotions. So it might be that it might be negative emotions. You know, they're anxious, they're worried about something, and they're trying to come back to a place of calm, but or frustrated with something. We're trying to come back to a place of calm. But it also can be that they're just overstimulating. Something is too excited, or they're really, really happy. So kids can, you know, use stimming in those situations, or they're just bored. So they're just doing it to stimulate themselves. So I think what to think about is stimming is not bad. It's not bad unless it is harming the kid. If they're harming themselves, and there are kids, it is not common, and it would not be, I would imagine it wouldn't be common in someone that would join your class, but sometimes kids bang their heads or maybe bite themselves. Obviously, you would want to interfere in those situations and try to stop the behavior. I don't expect you're going to be put in that situation though. I have not. Well, I guess I have in some more severely impaired classes with kids that also have some other co-occurring things. But the other time when maybe you feel like you need to interfere is if it is significantly interfering with class. If it is so loud and disruptive that you cannot go on with your activities. So what do you do in those situations? Well, first, think about it like you would think about any kid with a problem. What is the trigger? Is there a trigger? What is making the student do this? Is it because there is something that's making them really, really anxious that I have not addressed yet in the class? Or I've changed routines on this kid and I wasn't able to give them an advance notice. So it might be things that, okay, well now I've learned for next time, I can make this better for that kid. So I think really just, if there is some stimming going on, even if it's not disruptive, I wouldn't necessarily view it as a problem, but if you notice that it's happening and it seems to be more out of distress, I would look at it as a signal and what can I do to alleviate the distress. But if it is happening because they're bored or they're excited and it is not disrupting class, just ignore it, let it be. It feels good to the kid. It's, it's serving a purpose, a very helpful purpose for the kid. And obviously never punish student behaviors. The other thing is you can provide a replacement behavior. So if it's, okay, when you're rocking in your chair and it is so loud that it's, maybe I'm going to put a therapy band on the legs and you can kick it and do some rocking, or maybe I give you a exercise ball to sit on and you can rock on that and it is not as loud. So thinking about how you can allow the child to achieve a similar motion, a similar feeling in a less destructive way. Does that make sense? Okay. Okay, the other thing is, this is also something that I really was not taught in my graduate training and really have just become aware of by listening to autistic voices, is social masking. Social masking is when a child, anyone with autism, is trying to appear neurotypical. So they are trying to hide some of their autistic traits. They're trying to kind of follow the social conventions that they have been taught so that they don't look autistic. And it really can be adaptive. It can help them be more successful in school. They're not getting in trouble all the time. Maybe they are securing some friendships, or it can help hold down a job. So there really are some adaptive reasons that people do it, but it's also, how it comes at a cost. It's exhausting. It can really cause some mental health issues. And it also hides the difficulties that a person is having. So I think I bring this up just as something to keep in mind as people, parents and people who are moving into this educator role for other people's children, is how can I create an environment where we aren't trying to change a person to become more like us, but we are accommodating their unique needs so that they can be themselves. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, behavioral outbursts. So this is not uncommon for any individual on the autism spectrum to have some behavioral outbursts from time to time. Because they do run into a lot of roadblocks. Yes, y'all help yourselves. Oh, and I meant to say, if anybody needs to go to the bathroom, I guess we could take an actual break, or if people just want to get up and leave.
Do we need sparkling water?
It's really loud in my head, but I realized crunch away. It's not bothering me. Okay. So some things that might cause outbursts, and this is not an exhaustive list, but this maybe kind of hits some of the top things. So students don't understand the expectations. So maybe you have not been explicit enough or clear enough about what the expectations are, because most kids just kind of get it. Most kids can kind of fill in the gaps that you didn't maybe even realize were gaps in your explanation. So thinking about maybe how detailed you need to be, how much you need to model and practice something with a student. There's unexpected changes in routine. So this one's really important. If you're changing a procedure, or if you're going to be out that day, anytime there's going to be a change and you know about it, it could still be hard for the kid. It probably will still be hard, but if you could give them a heads up, give the parent a heads up, then they can better prepare themselves to maybe ease some of that difficulty. And that's true that'll be helpful for all your kids, especially those younger kids too. That sensory overload can be a big challenge. Work is too challenging or too easy. So if my frustration level just reaches its max, something is way too hard for me, either in a social situation or in an academic situation. It's just too tough, or it's too easy. I'm so bored. Like, ooh, just get me out of here. I'm so bored. Maybe a student doesn't understand social cues. So something happens there, or they're just feeling general social stress. And it might kind of hit a boiling point. There's executive functioning difficulties. So when we talk about executive functioning, is it anybody familiar with, I know I've thrown that term out a couple of times now. Your executive functioning, we're thinking about that prefrontal cortex of your brain. It's kind of the manager of your brain, the boss, the CEO. It is a part of our brain that directs attention. It helps us to hold back on impulses, to think before we act. It helps us shift from one activity to another or be more flexible in our expectations. So it has a lot of roles. And there are deficits, we'll talk about this in ADHD. This is the prime area of difference for kids with ADHD is in that executive functioning. But one thing is it can be really hard to control your emotions. You can go from 0 to 60 and then you are in full meltdown mode before your brain has caught up at all. And then the other thing is difficulty communicating. It can be extremely frustrating if you cannot get your needs across, your point across, what you want to say. Okay, I wanted to move into some specific accommodations. These are something, like I said, not every kid is going to need all of these things, but if you can keep them in mind, they will be helpful. So explicit instruction, I've said that a couple of times. What that refers to is you are being crystal clear. You are not leaving anything open to interpretation. You are going to model. You're going to show them exactly what you want them to do. You are going to allow them to practice, and then you're going to give corrective feedback. When you see that something wasn't right, you're going to jump in tactfully, respectfully, maybe go back and model it again. Oh, that wasn't quite right. Let me show you again. Have them practice again. Wash and repeat. You're going to do that over and over again. Differentiate instruction, of course, we talked about. Using concrete language, we talked about again. As much predictability as you can create, in your routines and your procedures. You can give kids a list of daily activities. That might change. What you do every day might change. One thing you can do in that situation is just give them a list at the beginning of class. Like, here's what we're going to be doing today. First, you're going to be using the first 5 minutes to, write in your journal. Then we're going to be doing the next 20 minutes, such and such. So give them a list. With little kids, it can be pictures. You can just draw them. You do not have to be afraid for this, but it'll just be a reminder to them if they can't read yet, so that they can then go down their list and they know exactly what to expect for that day. Let's see, reducing. So some things you can do to help with sensory overload. Noise canceling headphones. My 7-year-old is definitely neurodiverse, not formally diagnosed, but not with autism, but definitely with ADHD. We definitely have some sensory things that go along with that. Thankfully, he goes to public school and did full day public pre-K and was just matched with the perfect teacher for him. It could have been a horrible year, but she saw early on that he was so overstimulated. There were 20-something kids in the class. He had not been in a daycare setting except for when he was very little. So he had no experience with that. He was on overload all the time. And she recognized that right away. And we sent in noise canceling headphones. We wore them every day for almost the entire school year. And he did great. Like, he had such a great year. He was able to wean off of them by the end of the year and didn't need them the next year. I sent them thinking like, oh, he might need them at the beginning of the year. He did awesome. When he did not have them, he was having big meltdowns in class. And it was such a simple fix for him. It just brought everything down to a more manageable level. She would have times when she would ask him to take them off if they're all sitting down. It's a quiet time. She's reading a book or giving instruction. And so they developed some rules around how to use them, but it really, really helped. The other thing I did for him was he is an oral kid. He chews on everything. He would chew on his shirt, and his whole shirt would be soaking wet and super disgusting. Or if he didn't have, he might pick something else up to chew on it. So I sent him with a chewing necklace, and he would chew on this thing. And it is like the best replacement behavior, because that need isn't going to go away. I can't punish it out of him, but I can get him so he stops chewing on my darn couch cushion by bringing him a chewy. So that can be something. Be aware of like perfumes and lotions if you're somebody who uses something like that. We said fluorescent light sounds like it's not going to be a problem. A study carrel, this is not something you're going to need for right now. But when you do move into more academic tasks, if there are independent tasks where a student needs concentration, this is helpful for all kids. But a study, do you guys know what I mean by a study carrel? It's kind of like, creates a barrier. It's like a cardboard thing that you're in, and you're in like a tiny little cubicle at your desk. But yeah, because you wanted to, or because you needed it. Other people needed you to. But it really can be helpful in blocking out, things around you. Have any of you guys taken a test, like a really important test, and all of a sudden it was like you could not think, like your anxiety is so high, any little sound in the room, it felt like you just couldn't think, or any distraction around you. So it really can help kind of eliminate some of that. Okay. Okay, we kind of talked about some of those other things. The calming space, providing visuals are really helpful, especially for younger kids, but maybe even for some older kids. So if you have directions, if you're giving directions, maybe you're providing a little visual, maybe you just draw it on a board. Here are the steps for this thing that we're doing, a quick picture that goes along with each of them. Or if there's an important rule that somebody's having trouble following, especially at the younger years, just having a little picture, a little stop sign or something like that. Visuals can be really, really helpful. Anticipate that social situations might be tougher. So think about that and how you might need to accommodate for that if group work is required, and if that doesn't work for your student. How you might provide some other options. Try not to put them on the spot. Don't cold call your, a student who is socially anxious. If you do feel like you want to call on them, give them advance warning. Hey, I'm going to ask you to talk about, your experience creating that slime when we're done. Okay, be ready to share, and they'll let you know if that's something that we can do, but just an advance warning there. So any kind of social situation, think about that. Providing choice and assignments. Again, some of these things are going to be more applicable to more like academic tasks. Providing choice and assignments. Giving alternatives to handwriting. Fine motor skills can be tough. So instead of handwriting something, maybe they are telling you orally and you're writing it, or they're using a voice to text software, or they're typing on a computer. So allow those different ways. Organization can be tough, so that's something you can help with. Support transitions, so you can give, and this is helpful for all kids, advance warning. You can give like a transitional activity. So something that comes to mind is, the cleanup song for little kids. Okay, it's time to clean up. We're moving on to clean up, clean up. That's an example of a transitional activity, or maybe you put on some music or something. Some kids, like a transition partner, can be really helpful. If you have a kid that has trouble transitioning, maybe you create a buddy system. You find a kid that is well suited, well matched to work with that student, and we move through the transition together. And I'm here to help you if you have little bumps along the way. Also utilize those special interests and talents. Don't try to, let them teach you something, or incorporate those interests to help them become more engaged in the things that you're learning. Okay, questions about autism?
I sort of, this is kind of like a broad question about autism, but because of the nature of homeschooling,
Mhm.
we get a lot of kids that maybe haven't had resources or
Mhm.
been able to do that, like camouflaging thing a little better because of their environments.
Right.
And so when they come to us in a classroom setting, now all of a sudden it's like, oh, wow.
Right.
A lot of those things sort of jump out.
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts or feelings on like, is that ever an appropriate thing to approach a parent about and say, hey, we've noticed these things, is that something you've noticed? Or,
Yeah.
like, do you just kind of like do the accommodations and leave it?
So in my role as a school psychologist, like that is my job. So I would, tactfully try to bring those things up. But I do, I think you just have to be gentle and tactful. And it might be something they're like, oh yeah, I know, they have autism. They were diagnosed when they were 1. And you're like, oh, okay.
Maybe the question will help lead them to that.
Or yeah, hopefully. I mean, but honestly, I have had kids come to school whose parents know that they are on the spectrum, but they've even gotten clinical, like outside clinical testing, but they will not share that with the school. So, I would say that that is the exception. Like most, that would not be usually what you run into, but you could. There could be some defensiveness there. Or maybe they just want their kid to have a fair shot and they feel like if we disclose a disability that it will be treated in some certain way. But honestly, I think about myself as a parent, and sometimes, we don't see our kids objectively like other people can sometimes. We also don't see them in all the same settings that other people do. We see how they are at home or when we go out into the community. But I think that it is helpful. I would want to know if someone saw some autistic traits in my kid. Like, hey, I see some red flags. List what those things are. I know those can be associated with autism. Has that ever crossed your mind? Or maybe you don't even say autism. Maybe you just say, I see these red flags, wondering what you're thinking, or like maybe talk to your doctor about it, or something like that. I think just kind of read the parent say, but obviously disclose your, I'm not an expert in autism, but I have worked with some other kids on the spectrum before, and I've just noticed some things. I wonder what your thoughts are. It might be a hard conversation, but ultimately, I think if you're a parent and your kid gets to middle school and teachers have known all along that this has been a problem, but no one has mentioned it to you, and all of a sudden you're broadsided by something that just wasn't on your radar at all, that is way harder.
I think it's really hard with homeschoolers, though, especially because, they're with their kids. So
Like it may be hard to see the objective things that maybe other people
and to
see.
address it. Yeah, it would be really hard.
Mhm.
I've just always wondered about like the appropriateness of that, like just as like looking at yourself as an educator in that movie, because it is a really legally line for us. Like a lot of these people are our friends, and a lot of people, we do have a lot of new families that are coming in, but which is gonna present new and challenging and great things, but it's such a wiggly space when you're homeschooling.
I definitely think that you should, at a minimum, always tell parents about the challenges that you're not trying to come to them every day for every little problem, because that's overwhelming, not helpful. But here are some patterns of things that I've noticed that are challenging for your kid. Here are some of the things that have helped in the classroom. Just wanted to let you know. Yeah, that is tough. It was really tough. I've had some of those tough conversations, and even from a person who has some expertise in the area, it's really challenging. Okay, I'm ready to move on. Okay, ADHD. This is something you probably are going to see a lot more of because the prevalence is higher. So what is it? We probably all have a good lay understanding of what ADHD, but like I said, this is a difference in brain functioning that affects your frontal cortex, which this is the host of your executive functioning. So the primary things that are going to be, or that can be influenced, your attention span, activity level, and impulsivity. So there are 3 subtypes of ADHD. We used to have different terms. We used to say ADD and ADHD. Now, and for a while now, The term has just been ADHD for all of it, but then you can specify the different subtypes. So you have those kids that are primarily inattentive. These are kids that might go unnoticed for a long time. They could be really quiet in the back of the classroom and you don't realize that they are a grade level behind in reading because they've just been quiet here, you have the kids who are primarily hyperactive and impulsive. They can focus their attention just fine. They're not distractible, but they are bouncing all over the walls. And then you have kids who have both, all of it going on at once. So what does it look like in the classroom? So trouble sitting still, fidgety, of course. And this is not for every kid, but some of the things you might see, those explosive emotions. I know that's something that we really struggle with my oldest, is the stopping and thinking, the emotions just explode on out. And that can be really hard in the classroom and as a parent. Having trouble waiting for your turn, impulsive decision-making, trouble delaying gratification. So they might always choose what feels good now, even if it's at the expense of something better later on. Social immaturity. So sometimes there is some difficulty in figuring out, like, they have some social things going on. They're just not fitting in. Or maybe it's the spectrum stuff. There's a difference in maturity. Like they just are kind of young for their age, and then just like a qualitative difference, if that makes sense. So with ADHD, it's very common for those kids who are hyperactive and impulsive to just have some immature, they kind of are annoying sometimes among their peer group. Okay. Trouble maintaining attention, of course, easily distracted, trouble getting started on work. So sometimes getting that momentum going can be hard. Making careless mistakes. So that goes with that impulsivity. We're rushing through, making lots and lots of mistakes, just trying to get it done. Or just not paying close attention to detail. Maybe it's not that I'm trying to get done, but I'm just not able to attend to all the detail that I need to attend to. Forgetful. So they have more trouble with memory tasks. They're more likely to forget something. They might be a daydreamer. So they're kind of off, thinking about whatever in class. Poor working memory. So this is something we see a lot. We can do tests of working memory. And basically your working memory is really anything you're actively thinking about and processing in any given moment. So a school example of this would be if I give you a math problem to work out in your head. Some people can hold more information in their mind and manipulate that information in some way than others. And working memory really impacts all areas of things. If you're trying to remember all of the steps in a procedure and a task that I have to do, I have to kind of keep all of those things in mind. If I'm writing and I'm trying to remember to spell things correctly, to put punctuation, I'm trying to remember my main idea, but also the sentence that I'm writing right here. And how do I write the letter B? Is it this way or this way? That is so much to keep in your mind at once. And if you struggle with working memory, those things are going to be even harder. Some students, another thing that we see is that students are more likely to process information more slowly than other kids. So things are going to take them longer. They're going to just need more time to think through. They might need more time to give you an answer. You call on them. They might need some think time before they give you a response. Or they might take longer just for their output on a test or an experiment or whatever you're doing. For organizations, they'll often need some assistance there. The really beautiful deer in your backyard. Want to join the training maybe. And then low frustration tolerance. Again, that I think goes hand in hand with that impulsivity, emotion control kind of stuff. Okay, so some things that you can do to accommodate. Yes, please do.
I've heard that ADHD looks different in girls than in boys. Are there like certain things that you see more often in girls as opposed?
Well, normally, so if we compare girls and boys and just look at a typical group of kids, activity level tends to be higher in boys than it is in girls. So I think it's probably not as identified as easily because it's so much easier to see in a boy. You see a boy, or maybe more extreme because naturally the activity level is a little bit higher in boys. And so I think that plays a role. What we try to do a lot of times when it's being diagnosed, you do a lot of rating, you do some observations, but you're also doing rating scales, asking a parent or a teacher, what are you seeing in your classroom? How well do they pay attention? How much do they pay attention to detail? All of these things. And then when you're calculating scores, that student's scores is being compared to their same age and gender, because activity level looks different at 3 than it does at 10. Boys and girls are different too. So I think sometimes girls maybe just get overlooked, and that's true for autism as well. Autism, as somebody who has worked with lots of different kids, those kids that are kind of borderline, if a kid has a lot of symptoms, they're very impairing, they look very prototypical, they're easy to pick out. But those kids that are kind of borderline, it can be really, really tricky. And girls, especially, they seem to be a little better at social masking, and boys tend to be. So it is a really hard thing. Okay, so from my experience working with kids with ADHD, here's what tends to be helpful. So preferential seating, that can be different for every kid. So sometimes it means sitting closer to you, being more nearby, because your proximity is going to be really helpful to help keep attention on task. If you notice that a kid attention is wandering or they're acting up, a really simple thing to do, you don't even have to say their name. You just can walk over and just start teaching next to them, and they're like, it can just kind of help get them back on track. But away from distractions, if there's a group of peers that are constantly getting them off task, that can be helpful. Giving them extra time to do things, because with inattention, with difficulty, without memory and that processing speed, things just take longer. So allowing for that extra time, giving assistance with organization. This may not be as big of a thing now, or maybe it is. Maybe kids do have to organize materials in some of your classes. But certainly as they move into more academic subjects with you, they may need more help organizing an agenda with their paperwork, or my kid's desk, his teacher would always say it's just like a freaking explosion. And just like spilling out all over the floor. So he struggles with organization a little bit. Reduced workload. So this is something that can be really helpful. So if I'm giving the class, 15 math problems, well, maybe I'm only giving you 10, but they are the most important ones for you to do. I'm not making you over practice something that you maybe already have a good handle on, or I'm going to break it into smaller chunks. I do think it's important for you to do all of these problems, but I want you to start with these here. I'm going to cut this worksheet in half. Go take these, do these first, come back to me, take a short break, and then I'm going to give you the other half. Lots of breaks, highlighting key information. This could be something that is really helpful for you guys. Hey, this is important. That sounds silly, but like actually saying, this is important, alerting their attention, like, okay, I need to tune in right now to this piece of information. When you're giving instructions, get the student's attention first, make sure you have their attention, keep it brief, put it in writing, that helps. Have a student repeat it back to you. And if it's more individualized, getting down on eye level and talking to them instead of talking to them across the room. I know we are all guilty of that, at least I am in my head all the time. It always is better when I walk over to them and give them my instructions. Okay, I already said organization, sorry, that's a repeat. Outlets for movement or energy. So like little fidget toys. That's something that's kid to kid, and it's you know, it is something you have to teach them how to use. You can't just give them a fidget and expect that it's actually going to be helpful. You have to give them some instruction about, okay, when you use this fidget, you use it quietly in your lap. You still are paying attention. You're not looking at what you're doing. You know, if I find that it's becoming a distraction, I'm just going to tap you on the shoulder to remind you. And it may not work for all kids. For some kids, it's maybe more of a distraction, but for others, it might just kind of help keep their hands busy. Like I said, therapy bands. Do you guys know what I mean by therapy band? Those like stretchy workout bands. You can wrap them around your leg, the chair legs. I know that this is useful because my son is a chronic chair tipper and was falling into his chair all the time. I mean, at home he does that all the time. But at school he was too, and they put one of those things. That was one of the things that was really helpful. And instead of tipping his chair, he could still get that movement he needed, but he was just kicking the therapy band. It made a really, really big difference for him. Maybe letting a kid stand, you know, if the chair is not working for him, let him stand to work, let him move. If it's not interfering, you know, be flexible in how a kid is sitting or standing, whatever. Okay. Again, those noise canceling headphones that I felt, you know, reducing the sensory stuff can be helpful in focusing attention for everyone. Voice to text, again, can be helpful. A lot of kids with ADHD do tend to struggle with writing as well. So providing some alternatives when you can is helpful. If you're doing a more academic task, something you could do is audio record a lesson. If it's something they need to like go back to and fill in the gaps later, they can do that. Sometimes giving opportunities to retake and redo, you know, and this is especially, you know, you guys have so much flexibility, and I don't know if y'all are doing grades or whatever, but your ultimate goal, right, is for them to master the material, not to get a grade. So letting them redo something as much as they need to until they fully mastered something. Okay. Questions? How are we doing on time? Sorry, I'm chatting. Okay, is this helpful? Are you guys learning some strategies? Okay. Let's see. Learning disabilities. Let's see what we have to go through. Learning disabilities is something that I can touch on this if you want, or we can skip ahead. It's up to you guys. Since you aren't going to be doing, I mean, you will have kids who have learning disabilities in your class. It may or may not affect them as much. What's everybody's time like? Do people need to get out of here right at 1 o'clock? I don't. Okay. I mean, we're not taking that much longer, so we'll go ahead and go through it. No, I don't. No, I don't. I'm just going to my wonderful children. We're good. I do love them. But I am coming on. Okay. So learning disabilities, you know, this is just a difference in how their brain, like other disabilities, is processing information, but it is specifically influencing areas of learning. So the biggest areas are reading, writing, and math. Reading accounts for the most of the learning disabilities out there. So of kids identified with learning disabilities, about 80% of those have disabilities in reading. The reading disabilities come from more language-based processing aspects of your brain, and that is going to lead to trouble learning. You know, you might have trouble learning how letters and their sounds go together. A lot of kids with reading disabilities have very early difficulties manipulating the sounds. We call it phonemic awareness. They have trouble figuring out how I can manipulate sounds within words. Rhyming is part of that, or being able to segment words, taking a word like popsicle and being able to say popsicle, or even more popsicle, or hearing those sounds and being able to put them together. So a lot of kids with reading disabilities have a lot of trouble in those skills early on. You'll see kids that, you know, then they develop, you know, difficulties with accuracy, but also fluency. So maybe they get some of that accuracy down, but they just aren't as fluent in reading, and they're spending so much of their mental resources on figuring out what they're reading, decoding the words that they're not actually able to think about. A lot of times you see that comprehension is weak, and it isn't necessarily that they aren't able to comprehend the material. It's just that that's not where their, mental resources are going. Okay, it's also affects spelling and writing. So maybe their trouble with writing isn't just a writing disability, a standalone writing disability, but it's coming from when I'm writing, all I'm doing is thinking about what sounds make up this word. I can't keep my train of thought to organize this sentence or this paragraph, or I can't spell words close enough to even be readable to someone else. Okay, so math disabilities, calcula impacts computation, just our ability to actually solve the problem in front of me, 2 + 2 = 4, but also more of the conceptualization aspects of it. So understanding those concepts that go behind it, being able to solve like application problems can be challenging as well. And then writing disabilities, it might be a student is a great reader, but they aren't able to get the thoughts from their head down onto paper. So some of the different processes that can impact, so the executive functioning definitely is going to, like we've talked about, is going to impact academics. But also just, you might see kids that just have difficulty with memory or with the phonological processing, like I talked about, processing speed or spatial skills. So learning disabilities affect kids of all general ability levels, all intellectual levels. But there might just be an area of psychological processing or kind of cognitive processing that is just particularly weak for that student. So what should your instruction look like for these students? Differentiated, of course, this is super important for them because the class might be well beyond their level. So you need to find out how you can teach your learning objectives to these students in a way that they can actually get something out of. If it's too hard, obviously, there's no point for them. And that's so frustrating. I mean, these kids, especially in public schools, these kids might come to you really defeated because they have spent so much time bad at it, and maybe they put so much work into it through all these interventions that the school has tried. And maybe it's just, it's kind of squashed their love of learning a little bit because it's just been so hard. So making sure that it's not too challenging. That explicitness in instruction, modeling, frequent practice, they're going to need to practice things more than other kids. They're going to need to review more than other kids. They'll have more forgetting in that area. That's tough for them. And then, of course, we need to get corrective feedback. These are like foundational for just good teaching, but especially important when our kids have learning disabilities. Okay. Many of these things, really, I think you guys can read these on your own because they're going to mainly be applicable once you guys are doing more academic subjects.
No, we come back.
Yeah, and come back and talk about that and some more. If you do have a kid just for the future that comes to you from a public school, you can ask to read their IEP if the parent will share it. And they should have already identified a lot of things that are helpful for the kid. So that could be something that's useful to you as well. But really you want to think about, okay, what is their holdup? What is the thing? What is their disability area? And what is the objective of my lesson? If it's not to actually test that specific thing, reading, for example, do I need to make them try to read this on their own? No, it's just going to get in the way of them showing me what they know. Then, if I'm trying to teach a more advanced math concept, if the actual calculation of the problems isn't important, well, I'm going to let them use a calculator so that they can actually free up their brain to think about the deeper concepts here and show me that they understand, the algorithm or how to solve this type of problem. So that's just kind of the how to think about that. Okay. Questions about that? Okay. The last thing that I have planned to talk about, and just to touch on briefly, is I know You know, a lot of these kids are probably coming to you for the first time, maybe, after all these COVID restrictions. And so that definitely provides some unique challenges. I definitely don't know all of the solutions that, but just some things to be aware about. You know, your kids are going to be unacclimated to the school setting. It's going to be new to them. They're going to kind of forget, you know, some of the things. Oh yeah. And honestly, for kids who are older, you know, it's not going to take long for them to get into the swing of them, most of them. But you know, they're going to be so excited maybe to see their friends, or maybe you're going to have kids who are super socially anxious because they have been in their house for so long and maybe they're really scared of getting COVID, or maybe they just feel like they don't know how to do this anymore with other kids and they're nervous about that too. So I think kind of just being aware that those things can happen and keeping them in mind. You know, obviously you're going to have some kids that are going to be going through grief, you know, maybe they have lost family members as well. But one thing to keep in mind is that this increase in anxiety and stress can impact attention. So you might see a kid who, and this is true, COVID or not COVID, a kid is having a lot of attention problems in class. Well, maybe they have a lot going on. Maybe it's not like an attention specific problem. It's actually that all this other stuff is going on in their life. So yeah, honestly, I don't have much advice for you aside from creating a safe space, allowing kids to talk about what they need to talk about, not avoiding it because it feels uncomfortable, but also making sure that we're from the beginning creating a space that is respectful, that kids can, because all kids are going to be in different places. Some families, you might have some families that, you know, kind of didn't believe it was a big deal and being anti-maskers, and you might, you know, it's definitely in a school setting, you know, we have kids that come from all different backgrounds, and kind of thinking about how might we navigate that in the classroom. And even if you do, are you going to have kids wear masks? Mm-hmm. So even if you do have kids wearing masks, there still might be kids that come from all those different backgrounds, even if they're wearing a mask in the class. So thinking about when you're talking about things, not making assumptions. The other thing to think about is what happens if a kid doesn't want to wear a mask and they take it off. I think that's something that public schools really had to struggle with this year. And how much are you going to make that an issue? Because that can turn into a power struggle so super fast. So I think thinking about that ahead of time is kind of figuring out what your plan is going to be for that. It's helpful. Do you guys have thoughts? What are your concerns and worries
About that specific.
or just anything about that topic? I feel like I don't have very specific guidance other than just more general things.
Yeah, we just thought, you know, providing a spot for them to take breaks, you know, with their masks would be a good alternative, mainly the little kids.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna be difficult because some of our kids are older and will be vaccinated. Too, and
Oh yeah, that is a challenge.
how do we tell them, no, you have to keep it up?
Yeah. That is tough. And somebody mentioned on the questionnaire about the possibility of separation anxiety being more intense for some kids. And I think that is a super good point. Really for all kids, but especially for younger kids, you know, maybe this has felt like a traumatic time and I've been with my parents and it has felt safe to me in my house. Now that I'm leaving and I'm worried that something is going to happen to them or something is going to happen to me, and I don't want to leave you. So that's definitely something to keep in mind.
The only other thing I think that I wrote is we have a new student and we've known the student forever. So we kind of know some of the background, but any ideas for like behavioral defiance type situations, I think that's my toughest one dealing with. Like the others, I like understand it and I can, but when they're like smiling at you and keep doing it.
Yeah, that's tough, right? Because that pushes all of our buttons too.
Yeah.
my 4-year-old is like that. And he has been such a challenge for me. But I think for those kids, the relationship is so important. So really, really working with those kids from the beginning to try to form a positive relationship with them is really helpful. And avoiding power struggles at all costs, because that is not, you're not going to be able to strong arm your way, or if you do, it's not going to have good consequences down the road. Allowing them to save face whenever you can. So if there is something that you need to approach them about, do it super, you know, on the fly if you can, super respectfully. And then I think going back to that like cross-screen model of problem solving, like I've noticed that this time seems to be tough for you, or this situation is tough with that, and trying to get to the root of that problem. And that might be where your emergency plan has to come in, and then you do all those things. And you're still getting the big middle finger all day long,
Right.
you know, and work with the parent too. Like, I want your child to be successful. I want them to stay in this classroom, but we're all going to have to put our heads together because this isn't working. I think everybody needs to share the burden of responsibility. On that. That is really hard. Really hard. What else?
The family questionnaire, making some of this, like, for us, we're going to be just having a couple of questions attached to our broader community guidelines for behaviors and things like that. But what is like an effective way that you found for parents to share information they have about any neurodiverse qualities in their child without sort of, I don't know,
Asking them directly.
or just making it like an open option? I'm having trouble sort of knowing, like, in your experience, what is a question that parents are usually responsive to? How it's worded.
I have to think about that. I mean, I think you could always ask, does the child have any diagnoses that we need to be aware of? Or you could phrase it neurodiversity. Some parents might be familiar with that, some might not. You could kind of couch it in, you know, anything that might affect their success in class, or grouping it along with, like, do they have any allergies? Do they have any medical conditions? Do they have any, sometimes, but also, you know, you can put a statement at the top about, you know, you can leave what you want to blank, I guess, you know, making it optional to respond. Or if you don't want to ask specifically, you can ask just, I mean, because is it really important to know that somebody has a diagnosis of autism or not? Maybe not for your classroom purposes, but is it important to know that they are super behaviorally rigid? Yeah, you need to know that. So maybe getting more at what are some things that are tough for your kid? What are some strategies that you find that works? What doesn't work? Those kinds of things.
Yeah, like the general questions that I think parents are more likely to answer.
I know most parents are going to want to tell you.
Yeah.
They'll talk to you all day long about things that are hard.
We'll get even more info that way, because a child may not have something diagnosed, but they do have these things in the classroom.
And you know, knowing that the kid has autism might tell you some things, but doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't tell you what their specific needs are.
L'Oreal or Nicole, did you have questions?
Good. Like, this has been super helpful. So I don't have any questions, but thank you.
You're welcome.
I do have a question from very early on.
Yes.
You were mentioning a doctor somebody that you like, and I didn't catch who you were saying.
Dr. Becky. Actually don't know her.
It's Dr. Becky Good Inside.
Her website is Dr. Becky Good Inside. It used to be Dr. Becky at Home was her, but I think she's changed it all to Look up,
podcast.
just Google Dr. Becky Good Inside. Her podcast is called Good Inside. She also has a lot of workshops that I have never done, but they all look awesome and reasonably priced.
They have like she's a reparenting one, right? That like
Mhm.
helps you recognize your triggers, so you can stay calm with your kids.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, she's awesome. Have you done any of her workshops before? No. Yeah, they all look awesome. So yeah, she's an
Dr.
awesome
Becky
resource.
Thank you.
Dr. Becky. Okay, her Instagram is Dr. Becky at the,
Not this
no,
number.
just
18.
actually 18, Dr. Becky at Good Inside.
She's Dr. Becky.
Okay. Great, thank you.
Welcome. You will be a fan, I promise.
Ready to wrap up this recording today, but yeah.
Any other questions to our Zoom friends? Okay, we're gonna end the thing now. Bye.
Bye, guys.